They came for us in the blizzard. Only a few of us survived. I still remember the blizzard in Willow Creek Trailer Park. I was one of the residents who had grown accustomed to the harsh winters of this remote mountain town. But that year, the blizzard was unlike any storm we had ever experienced. It was colder, fiercer, and it brought something with it. Something evil. The blizzard was unrelenting, with no signs of stopping. The wind and snow were so fierce that it was impossible to see more than 10 meters, probably less. Even the strongest of the residents were struggling to cope with the extreme cold. The temperature had plummeted to dangerous levels, and our trailers were not built to handle such extreme weather. We rugged up as much as we could and hoped it would be over soon. But after 5 days, the blizzard had not died down. If anything, things seemed worse. It soon became apparent that we were ill prepared for such a prolonged storm. Our food and water supplies were running low, and we were forced to ration what little we had left. Some of those in the neighbouring trailers had already run out of food a day or two ago, and I, along with some of the other residents, had shared some of the little we had. To make matters worse, the blizzard had knocked out power and communication lines, and we were completely cut off from the outside world. The trailer park generators were old, but well maintained. They should be able to get us through this, I thought to myself, as I and some others worked on firing them up. It was a frightening feeling though, knowing that we were alone and isolated. The park's next neighbour was only 2 kilometres away, but in this blizzard. A few of us had decided to meet in Tony's trailer, which was one of the larger ones, to discuss what we should do if the blizzard continues at this rate. "I think we're going to have to try to make it to town. Ain't no one coming for us," Tony said, not even trying to hide his anger at the authorities for seemingly abandoning us. "Don't be stupid. You won't even make it to the park's front gate in this," Margaret, Tony's neighbour, had replied. Tony took a sip of his hot tea, thinking up a reply while the wind and snow battered the side of his trailer. "She's right, Tones. Hell, I live 20 metres up from your trailer and I almost got turned around out there. Snow's too deep to drive and you can't see the tip of your nose in that," Mike added. Tony grunted, more in annoyance than agreement, but didn't say any more. We spent the next few hours together, drinking hot tea and coffee and playing board games. We agreed that we would help each other out and the others in the trailer park as much as we could. No one wanted to talk about what would happen if this blizzard didn't die down soon, but I am sure we were all thinking it. "I think I'm going to call it a night. Thanks for the tea," I said as I started buttoning up the top buttons on my jacket. "Yeah, us too," Margaret said, standing up in unison with her husband John. With that, Mike, Sue and Phil also stood to leave, nodding and thanking Tony for having them over. Then, Tony's generator cut out. Sue emitted a small shriek of fear as the trailer was suddenly engulfed in thick darkness. Just as I reached the door, the power went out and I could see through the small window the lights in the neighbouring trailers flickering out one by one in the midst of the blizzard, like blown out candles. The outside was now nearly pitch black, and the inside, somehow, even darker. After a minute or so, a faint glow illuminated the interior of Tony's trailer home, as a few of the guests pulled out their mobile phones and switched on their flashlight. The light created flickering shadows around the room and failed to fully penetrate the corners, but it was still a relief nonetheless. Mike, who was next closest to the door, started to move towards the door and reached for the handle. "No, don't," I said quickly, grabbing his arm and pulling it away. "Hey, what the?" he started to say, but stopped himself as he watched me lock the door and put my finger to my lips. "Something's not right," I whispered. "All the generators can't just cut out like that. We need to be quiet and listen." We all stood there in silence, listening to the howling wind outside and the creaking of the trailer. It was then that we heard a faint tapping on the window. We all turned to look, but it was too dark to see anything outside. "Is anyone out there?" Margaret called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the tapping grew louder and more insistent. It was then that we saw the shadows outside the window, moving and shifting in the blizzard. It was clear that someone or something was out there, trying to get in. That's when Margaret repeated, "Is anyone out there?" Only her voice came from outside the trailer. I spun my head to look at Margaret, and in the dimly lit room, I saw the blood drain out of her face, eyes wide in terror. Someone, something, had mimicked her voice perfectly. We stood, frozen in place, not making a sound. "Is anyone out there?" Margaret's voice again, from outside the trailer. Margaret made a whimpering sound and collapsed into John's arms as her legs turned to jelly. "Is anyone out there?" This time the voice had dropped pitch. It was still her voice, but sounded more menacing. "Is there anyone out there?" We all jumped in fright as something slammed against the door. This time the door buckled a little. Now more knocking and tapping all around us, every window, every wall. A third loud hit against the door. Tony whispered urgently, "We need to barricade the door. Quick, find anything you can to block it." We sprang into action, grabbing whatever we could find. Chairs, tables, even the board games we had been playing earlier. We worked frantically, our hearts racing with fear as the banging on the door grew louder and more insistent. Finally, we had piled enough furniture against the door to make it difficult for anything to get through. Tony quickly gestured for us to move to the back of the trailer, away from the door. We stumbled over each other in the darkness, trying to get to the back of the trailer as quietly as possible. The tapping and banging on the door, windows and walls continued, growing more frantic by the second. We could hear other sounds now, too. Low, guttural growls and snarls that seemed to be coming from multiple sources. We huddled in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside, afraid to move or make a sound. Then, suddenly it stopped. It was peaceful outside, except for the sounds of the blizzard. As we listened, we could hear the distant sound of other voices, those of our neighbours. We cautiously approached the windows and peered outside. Despite the rapidly falling snow, we could observe shadowy figures near the adjacent trailers, contorting in unnatural ways. With their jerky movements and hunched postures, they beckoned to our neighbours. "No, don't open the doors," I heard myself whisper as I watched in horror as our neighbours did exactly that. Through the darkness and the snow, we watched in horror as the figures ripped the now open doors right off and dived into the trailers amidst screams of terror. "No," I heard Margaret whimper as we were left to sit helplessly and listen to the deafening screams of men, women and children echoing out around the trailer park. This was the longest night of my life. I can't say for certain when the final scream was heard, maybe around 3 or 4 in the morning. Overcome with terror, sadness and exhaustion, we dozed in and out of sleep. One by one, we woke to an unusual stillness that had been absent for a week. The blizzard had finally subsided, and the sun was peering through the last of the clouds. We took our time, but eventually made our way to the windows. Looking outside, we saw the park and all the trailers blanketed in layers of snow, and our neighbours standing in the snow, staring at our trailer. Their faces contorted into a sinister, unnerving grin that betrayed a hunger rather than happiness. We fled the trailer park, certain they would chase us down, they who had replaced our neighbours. But they didn't. They just watched us flee, standing in the snow with that terrifying grin plastered on their faces. We never returned to the trailer park. We abandoned the little we owned and now all have a share unit 2 towns over. It's still too close for me. The local news never reported on the events of that week, at least not what happened to the residents of the trailer park. But the Weather Channel warns that another blizzard, possibly more severe than the last one, is on its way. We have stocked up on enough supplies to last us a month, even longer if needed. If you find yourself in the area when the storm hits, I urge you do the same. And don't open your doors for anyone, especially not you. The animals sought refuge in my house during a blizzard. I think they were running from more than just the cold. By 11 velociraptors. I barely made it home in time. 1 minute I was singing along to the radio, and the next I was staring slack-jawed at the most menacing storm clouds I'd ever seen. As someone born and raised in Vermont, I was no stranger to snow squalls, but there was something foreboding about the dark clouds blowing in from over the mountains. After reaching my house, I opened my car door and stepped out into a cold evening. The wind lashed at my face and made a terrible howling in my ears as I raced up the steps and slipped through the front door to my house. Just in time, Luke said to me in greeting. My husband was standing in front of the living room window, surveying the mountains beyond our city. By the time I walked over to him, I could barely see 2 streets down. Seemed like we would be spending the evening inside. Came out of nowhere, I commented. Before I so much as set down my bag, I heard the doggy door open. We didn't own any pets, but we often entertained visits from a neighbourhood cat who Luke had named Rigatoni. Sure enough, an old orange cat soon appeared in our living room, leaving a trail of muddy paw prints as she trotted over to Luke. Ah, the serial couch surfer returns. Too cold out there for you? He asked the cat currently rubbing her head against his shin, who meowed as if in affirmation. Tony wasn't terribly fond of most people, but Luke had a way with animals. He reached down to pet her, eliciting a melody of purrs from the contented cat. Come on, he said, standing. I'll fix you some dinner. Thank God, I'm starving. I wasn't talking to you, Luke said with a warm laugh, walking into the back of the house to fetch some cat food for Tony. Half an hour later, just as Luke and I had finally sat down to eat, we heard the doggy door open once again. I raised a brow at my husband. Tony was our only regular 4-legged visitor, so I wondered who else could have just let themselves inside our home. I didn't have to wonder for long. Seconds later, a border collie tore into the living room, barking and whining with urgency. Luke and I both rose sharply from our seats at the table, watching the dog as it came to a stop in the corner of the room. I realised as the poor creature lowered its head and tucked its tail between its legs that I recognised it. Hey, that's Mrs. Johnson's dog, I said, rounding the table to check if the dog was hurt. Tucker? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I see her walking him all the time. I crouched down next to Tucker and slowly reached out my arm. To my surprise, the usually sweet-tempered border collie pulled its lips back in a snarl, lunging forward slightly and snapping his teeth. It was a warning, not an attempt to actually hurt me, but I backed off all the same. Luke shot me a worried look. He's usually more mild-mannered. I'll give her a call and let her know he's with us. Luke left the room to grab his phone while I studied Tucker from a safe distance, looking for signs of injury. His frantic barks had been replaced by occasional, mournful whines. He was no longer racing around, seemingly content with his place in the corner, but his posture remained fearful and defensive. It was hard to tell with the way he was cowering, but I saw no visible wounds on him. Do you have a signal? Luke shouted from another room. I dug my phone out of my pocket to check, and to my surprise, I didn't. We had generally reliable coverage, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd lost cell service. I tried restarting my phone, walking around to different spots in the house, and turning airplane mode on and off. Nada. Unfortunately, if it was affecting both of us, it was probably an issue with our service provider, meaning there was little we could do. I was about to ask if he still had Wi-Fi on his phone when a light but urgent tapping sound filled the room. I listened for a moment, trying to place the origin of the sound, and soon traced it to the bathroom, or more specifically, the bathroom window. When I got there, I saw a small, fuzzy animal standing on the windowsill and scratching fervently at the glass. What in the world? The little creature didn't seem to notice my presence. I took a few steps further into the bathroom and realized as I approached that the animal had torn right through the window screen. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no nothing. At least the lights are still on. Luke trailed off as he entered the room, looking over my shoulder at the frantic creature. Is that a weasel? I asked my resident animal lover, who shook his head. Pretty sure it's a marten. Neat. I was about to compliment his identification skills before I looked over and saw the look in his eyes. Don't ask me what I think you're about to ask me. Please. They're endangered, you know. This isn't Noah's Ark, Luke. We can't shelter every animal in Vermont. I swear the rodent took a break from ripping through my screen window to glare at me. I glared right back. Besides, this little fucker here looks rabid. Luke and I spent a couple of minutes arguing. I wasn't keen on taking in any more impromptu guests, but Luke was adamant on saving it from the storm. There's something off about how desperately it's trying to get in, he said. It might be on the verge of freezing to death or something. After a while, he convinced me to take pity on the marten. I had to admit, the way it was throwing itself against the glass was a little unsettling. Reluctantly, I opened the window and allowed it to squeeze through the hole in the screen. However, I didn't realize that the marten wasn't the only creature waiting to get inside. Before I could shut the window, a flurry of about 20 mice surged into the bathroom from the hole. They must have been sitting on the sill as well, but I guess I overlooked them, mistaking their fluffy white bodies for snow. I jumped backwards, swallowing a shriek as one of them landed right on my foot. Eventually, I managed to shut the window without stepping on any mice, but not before a red bird, a cardinal I think, squeezed its way in as well. Stunned, I hurried after the animals as they made a beeline for the centre of the house. When I entered the dining room, I saw not only Tucker and the animals who had just burst in through the bathroom, but also a cat and 2 dogs that I didn't recognise. Cursing, I realised that they must have entered through the doggy door, so I yelled out to Luke to lock it as I tried to make sense of the scene in front of me. The animals gave each other a wide berth. The cat didn't so much as look at the mice, nor did the dogs seem at all interested in the cat. All of them were cowering, shivering as they pressed themselves into corners or squeezed into whatever hiding spot they could find. The dogs whined, the mice squeaked. Even the cardinal was making a strange, almost mournful sounding chirping noise. The only one who was behaving normally was Rigatoni, who I had to shoo away from the troop of mice hiding under the china cabinet. What the hell is going on? Luke asked, and I had no explanation to offer. We'd had nasty storms before, but never had I seen one inspire such desperation in our local wildlife. After another failed attempt at coaxing Tucker out of his corner, I made my way to the living room and stared out the large window. A total whiteout stared back at me. I could only see a few feet out in every direction before the world was swallowed up by darkness and snow. It was eerie, but it was beautiful in a strange way. Hypnotic. It was easy to lose myself in thought as I watched the snow fall. What could have spooked the animals so much, I wondered. Could it really be the cold alone? The weather hadn't seemed all that bad. Sure, it had been cold outside, but not blizzard cold. When I had opened the bathroom window, I'd been distracted by the mice, but when I thought about it, I didn't remember a freezing cold wind sweeping into the house alongside our animal guests. I raised my arm, pressing the back of my hand against the glass, and then stilled. "Lou?" I quietly called out. He appeared around the corner seconds later, Tony cradled in his arms. "Is it just me? Or is the glass warm?" Luke stepped closer, shifting to hold the cat in one arm and placed his free hand against the pane. He didn't respond, but the way his mouth set into a thin line told me that he felt the same thing. What does this mean? I don't know. We both stood in silence for a while. The wind howled outside, but I had the sense that if I opened a window and stuck my hand out, it wouldn't feel cold. I didn't want to find out though. Opening any windows or doors at that point seemed like a bad idea. In fact, I was about to check that all entry points to our house were secured when Luke pointed at something outside. A large, black mass ambled its way towards us. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Its shape and gait was so strange that I thought I was looking at a brand new animal. But once it stepped fully into the faint glow emanating from the porch light, I realized that it was a black bear. Its lower jaw and one of its hind legs had been ripped off, and from the trail of blood it left in its wake, it was clear that the wounds were fresh. The bear stumbled closer, stopping only inches from the glass, and with every wary step, I could make out another laceration on its body. I watched in horror as the massive creature stared directly at us with a look in its eye that could only be described as pleading. I held its gaze for a few seconds, and then the creature collapsed onto its side. A puddle of dark red poured outward from its body, and soon the strained expression and contractions of its ribcage ceased. Never once did it look away from us as it bled out and died. There was a long silence before Luke and I dared to speak. "You think," Luke began, "you think that's what the animals were afraid of?" I hoped so, but something in my gut told me that it wasn't. After all, even if that was the creature they'd been running from, the question still remained. What could have inflicted that level of trauma on a black bear of that size? "I think we should get away from the windows." As we made our way to the middle of the house, the lights flickered once, twice, and then abruptly went out altogether. We were plunged suddenly into darkness, and it seemed to put the animals even more on edge than before. Their squawks and whines increased in volume as I procured 2 flashlights from our kitchen cabinet. I handed one to my husband, and then the 2 of us took to the dining room, sitting on the floor with our backs against one of the walls. Luke was calm on the surface, but I could tell that the strangeness of the situation was causing him distress. At least Tony's presence seemed to bring him some peace of mind. For some reason, she was unaffected by whatever ailed the others. I studied her as she relaxed in Luke's lap, her eyes closing as he absent-mindedly stroked her fur. Why was it that she was unafraid? She had come into our house right before the blizzard settled in, whereas the rest of the animals had likely been outside for longer. Had they seen something out in the storm? If they had, could it have been the same thing that killed the bear? "Hey," Luke's shaky voice broke through my thoughts. "Do you hear that?" I didn't hear anything, and then I realized I didn't hear anything. No wailing of the wind, no sounds from the animals, nothing. It was like the whole world had suddenly gone quiet. I looked around the room. All of the animals were so still, it was as if they were afraid to move. I clicked my flashlight off, wanting to attract as little attention as possible, and Luke followed suit. For a moment, we just sat there in the dark, listening. And then I heard a voice.
"Hello?
Clear as day, the voice of a person was calling us from outside our house.
"Hello? Anyone in there?"
It asked, its tone far too nonchalant for someone weathering the full brunt of a blizzard.
"I need some help out here."
Next to me, Luke shifted as though he were about to stand up. I reached out and grabbed a hold of his arm, grabbing Tony and pulling Luke back down to the floor. There wasn't a chance in hell I was about to let him investigate the voice. It was so strangely quiet that I could hear the crunching of footsteps in the snow as the person moved outside.
"Please,"
the voice said. It had gotten closer, like it was circling the house.
"Please, I really need help. Can I just come in for a minute? It's so cold out here."
My grip tightened on Luke's arm, the complete lack of emotion in the voice's tone sending a chill up my spine. He reached over, holding my hand in his as the source of the voice moved ever closer.
"Come on now. Don't you have room for one more?"
It was right outside the dining room window. I closed my eyes like a coward, not wanting to see whatever was about to step into view. Next to me, there was a single, sharp intake of breath. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. And then there was a light chuckle from just outside the window. There were more footsteps, but this time they were moving away from us, and they seemed to be taking the silence with them. The wind remembered itself, returning with a howling vengeance in the visitor's absence. Luke's hand had gone slack in mine, but I held onto it for a long time, sitting there with my eyes shut tight. It must have been an hour before I dared to open my eyes and breathe normally again. "Are you okay?" I finally asked. No response. I tried asking again, a little louder, and still my husband didn't respond. "Luke?" When I clicked on the flashlight, I saw Luke staring at the window, his face twisted into an expression of horror I'd never seen before. His skin was pale and his body was as rigid as a corpse. And try as I did, I couldn't get him to respond to me in any way. His look of sheer terror never once changed, even as I carried him to the car and drove us as fast as I could to the hospital. The doctors said it was a stroke. Of course, I was incredulous that such a thing could happen to my fit, non-smoking 29-year-old husband, but no one could offer me a better explanation. For the next few days, I waited for a recovery that never came. Then the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. While Luke regained some very minimal motor control, blinking and twitching his fingers, it was clear that he would never be the same. I became his full-time caregiver, spending my days attending to all of his needs and my nights praying that he would make a miraculous recovery. As of this evening, 5 years have passed since the storm. Old Rigatoni is still alive and kicking somehow, and her visits always seem to make Luke perk up just a little bit. She's sleeping on his chest as I write this, taking care of him in her own way. I'm glad to have her around, but even though I try not to be superstitious, her presence always brings me back to the night of the blizzard. I think about Tucker, who ran away after the storm passed and was never seen again. I think about the marten and the mice and the bear, and the way all of them acted like they were fleeing from something terrible. I think about the look on Luke's face, and I can't help but wonder if they all saw the same thing. Maybe Luke saw something he wasn't meant to, something that his brain had destroyed itself trying to comprehend. I look at my husband, the love of my life, and I can't help but mourn what was taken from me that night. If I had opened my eyes, if I had been brave enough to look, would I have met the same fate? "What did you see?" I ask him, like I have 1,000 times before. I never get an answer. My small town has bizarre weather today, and it's changing the people. By TheVampireSaga. My area often doesn't get a lot of snow during the winter months. It's a small town, barely mentioned on any major maps of the country. Yet, for whatever reason, we do get snow randomly during any type of season for some ungodly reason. It's like the earth suddenly decides to slam us with a few thousand pounds of snow all at once. Being a small town where everyone knows each other, goes to the same school, and works at the same totalitarian overlord supermarket or factory, it's a good thing everyone is so close to each other. Otherwise, someone could die with how fast the temperature drops in the winter. Suffice to say, it's miserable during the brief random periods we get actual snow. Usually my dad, if he remembers enough, has my brother help him collect firewood from the forest in the backyard. Of course, even with the tons of snow burying everything usually, the teachers still want everyone to go outside and nearly freeze to death getting to the bus stop. Usually, my parents have to fight tooth and nail for them to shut the school down. This time though, today, my parents relented after the principal explained how my brother's grades were failing, and that was enough to convince my dad to drive him over. I had to stay home due to a massive cold, and my mother didn't want anyone else to get sick at a school already dealing with the shitty weather. My parents said to me since it wasn't snowing that bad yet, they would be going to the store to grab us some emergency food in case the power did actually go out. So let me tell you about that store. It's the tiniest store you could possibly imagine. I'm not kidding. You walk in, take 20 steps, and you're pretty much at the back wall where they keep the canned beans and dusty old bags of chips. The ceiling is so low that even I have to hunch down a bit, and I'm not exactly a giant. It's the kind of place where you bump into Mrs. Jensen from down the street every time you go, and she insists on talking about her day for a good 20 minutes. Anyway, my parents bundled up into their winter clothing, promised they'd be back before I knew it, and headed out into the gathering snow to their car. The wind had picked up a bit, but the snowfall wasn't too bad at that point. A couple of hours passed, and I was starting to get that nagging feeling in my gut as I was watching TV. You know, the one that tells you something is just not right. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on my fever and the general creepiness of the snowstorm. But then, my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, and it was Mr. Thompson, our grumpy old neighbour. My dad used to tell me he was a war veteran of some kind and spent most of his free time either yelling at the neighbourhood kids throwing baseballs in his lawn, visiting his wife's grave, or watching TV. He's a miserable guy, but he's also one of the nicest people you'll ever meet once you get to know him. He rarely ever called, and I figured he must have needed something important. With a sigh, I answered, mentally preparing myself for whatever he was going to complain about this time.
Sam,
his raspy voice crackled over the line.
I need a hand with something. Are you interested?
I raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unusual request. This was usually the part where he'd talk about his war days and ramble on about them for 20 minutes. Sure, Mr. Thompson, what do you need help with? I responded while scratching my nose. He explained that his house could use a good cleaning, and he was willing to pay me $20 for my trouble. Now, I might have been feeling under the weather, but I wasn't about to pass up $20 for a bit of cleaning. Plus, it might be a welcome distraction from the worrying gnawing in the back of my mind. My parents still weren't back yet. All right, Mr. Thompson, I'll be right over, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my unease.
Good lad. Just make sure to bundle up. It's colder than a witch's tit out there,
he grumbled before hanging up the phone. I agreed, pulling on my warmest clothes and trudging through the barely an inch high snow to Mr. Thompson's house. His house was only about 30 feet away from mine, but the short walk felt like an eternity in that already biting cold. The temperature was dropping, and it was dropping fast. To explain the situation with the street that our houses are on, the area has very few houses with people in it. It's my mum and dad's house, Someone I've never met staying in one house, usually blasting his music through the neighbourhood, or empty abandoned houses. Mostly everyone lives closer to the supermarket, and it takes an extra 10 minutes for us to drive down to the actual town centre. Mr. Thompson's been staying near the house we live in for over 10 years, even as everyone moved to be closer to the store and other markets we have near the hospital, shopping area and sheriff's department. I finally reached Mr. Thompson's front porch, and as I knocked on the door, it swung open almost immediately, revealing Mr. Thompson himself. He was a tall, wiry man, with a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face. His silver hair was a bit unruly, and he had piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you, as if testing you in some way, like he was sizing you up. "About time," he muttered, stepping aside to let me in. I could already feel the warmth emanating from the house, a welcome relief from the icy air outside. As I stepped into his cozy living room, I couldn't help but notice once again the countless trinkets and memorabilia scattered around the place. Military medals hung on the wall, and old photographs from his war were arranged in frames on the fireplace mantel. It was like stepping into a time capsule of his life. It was the one reason why I always sort of liked coming over, even if Thompson was a miserable bastard on some occasions towards my mum. "So, you're here to help me clean, huh?" Thompson said, raising an eyebrow at me while looking around at his furniture. "Not the most exciting job, I'll admit." I chuckled, feeling a bit more at ease now that I was out of the cold. "Well, $20 is $20. Mr. Thompson smiled and handed me a worn-out mop and bucket. "All right then, lad, let's get to work. Kitchen's that way." I nodded and set to work, mopping the kitchen floor while he dusted the shelves. It was strange being in his house. Usually, my dad would be prying me away from helping him, but today he was nowhere to be found. "Come on, put your back into it, Sammy. In the army, they'd work us like total dogs and make us clean the shitter afterwards." My knees were starting to ache near the middle of the cleaning, and we weren't even halfway done yet, according to him. But I persisted on. In the middle of Mr. Thompson getting more cleaning supplies out of the bathroom upstairs, which took him a while to get up into in the first place, I went to a nearby window in the living room and looked out into the snow. It was hard to see outside with how much it was snowing, but it was overflowing with snow as the wind was picking up, shaking the shutters of the house as the wind hit the house. I saw something that caught my eye though, as I looked out through the blinds. At the end of the street on the corner, there were 5 people shuffling around in the snow. This wouldn't be outrageous in, say, a normal storm, but this was beginning to get into a full-on blizzard, and it was strange to see people walking around and not in their hot cars. Their movements were bizarre. It was like they were taking very slow and not at all fast steps through the cold snow across from my viewpoint. They didn't look in my direction at all, even though I think I was clearly visible just standing there. You figured they'd be trying to get to the warmest area possible like the house, but they just slowly walked by Mr. Thompson's house, slowly disappearing into the mist. Mr. Thompson came down eventually, and after he took a quick break from walking, we went back to cleaning. In the middle of cleaning, Mr. Thompson looked over at me with a confused expression on his face. "Where's your family?" Mr. Thompson asked, breaking the silence. "Your dad would usually be bugging you to come shovel his driveway by now," while pointing his thumb back at the door and dusting off a photo of him and his wife. I paused, not quite sure how to respond myself, honestly. "They went to the store," I finally said, "but they haven't come back yet." He grunted, a furrow forming on his brow. "The storm's picking up out there. Shouldn't be out in this mess." He looked at the analog clock near his TV. The time read 3 p.m, and they left just over 7 hours ago. They all had work off due to the weather suddenly shifting. "I know," I replied, my worry resurfacing. "I'm starting to get bothered by it a little." Mr. Thompson studied me for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "They'll be fine, Sam. Probably just stuck at the store or taking their time. You know how it is with young people. No offence. We worked in silence for a while after that conversation, cleaning up his cluttered living room. After what felt like an eternity of scrubbing and dusting, he finally called for a break. We settled down on his old, worn-out couch, exhaustion beginning to set in for the both of us as he handed me my $20. But I was less concerned now about the money and more concerned as to where the hell my parents were. Thompson shook his head, a grim look on his face. I've been through my fair share of storms, but this is something else. Nature's angry at us, it seems. I stole a glance at Mr. Thompson, who was lost in thought with a worried look on his face as he stared at the blank TV screen. After a moment, he turned to me. You're not going back out there, Sam, he said firmly. I don't care if you're helping me for money or not. This storm is getting worse by the minute, and I'm not letting you risk your life in this mess walking back to your house. So, you better get comfortable here in the living room. We can keep an eye on the news and wait it out. I wanted to argue, to insist that I should go home and make sure my family was okay. But as I looked out the window again and saw the snow whipping around in a frenzy, I knew he was right. The storm was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, and Mr. Thompson's concern was genuine for once. Just as I was resigning myself to the possible fate of having to listen to his war stories to pass the time, Mr. Thompson surprised me. He picked up his phone and started dialing, his fingers moving with practiced ease. He put the phone to his ear and spoke in a hushed tone, asking 2 people to come over from what I could hear. A short while later, the doorbell rang, and Mr. Thompson opened it to reveal a couple of his war buddies. They greeted each other with hearty handshakes and a few shared jokes before Mr. Johnson explained the situation. It turned out that he had called them over to help keep an eye on me and the situation outside. Sam, meet Jack and Mike, he said, introducing me to his war buddies. They're going to help me make sure you're safe until the storm blows over. I was taken aback by the gesture. These were tough, no-nonsense guys, veterans who had seen their fair share of challenges. Mike was a taller guy than the both of them, but he was noticeably more quiet. And Jack was more your standard aloof old southern hick who spoke in a funny accent like Mr. Thompson occasionally did while arguing with someone. And here they were, willing to watch over a worried teenager stuck in their midst. As if sensing my unease, Jack clapped me on the back with a friendly grin. Don't worry, kid. We've been through worse than a snowstorm. We'll keep you company while your daddy and ma are out. Mr. Thompson and Mike got busy closing all the windows and even wedged a towel at the bottom of the front door to keep the heat from escaping. They were taking this seriously, as if they were preparing for a battle of some kind. And then the old man went over to the phone as the other 2 were talking amongst themselves. He picked up the phone again and dialed a number. I realised he was calling the store where my parents were supposed to be after he identified a cashier my mum always talks to by name. Yeah, hey Martha, this is Robert Thompson, he said in his no-nonsense tone. I've got a young neighbour here, Sam, and his parents are at your store. Can you confirm if they're okay? I watched Mr. Thompson's face go from focused to pale, his expression slowly morphing into one of shock and disbelief. Jack and Mike looked over at him in silent confusion as he spoke more to the person on the other end. What do you mean they never walked into the store? Mr. Thompson demanded to know, his voice cracking with concern. They left his house hours ago. There's no way they could have gotten lost in this town. The tension in the room was palpable as Mr. Thompson listened to the voice on the other end of the line. I could practically feel the worry radiating off him in waves. And then, his expression turned even more confused as he heard the response. Martha, you're saying there's a bunch of people just standing outside the store, not moving, in this freezing weather. Do you know how fucking cold? Thompson paused, as if the other person was chewing him out. I cracked a grin out of habit of seeing him out of his element and pushed a curse. Martha, I get it. You're not seeing things. Did you try asking them what's wrong or why they're just standing there? Mr. Thompson sighed as the voice started up again, barely audible from the receiver. "Look, if they're not going to buy anything and just standing there, call the police. I don't know what else you want me to say." Mr. Thompson took his ear from the old-fashioned phone and spoke a few more times. "Hello? Martha?" The line went dead all of a sudden, as did the power only moments later, thrusting the room into an immediate chill besides the burning fireplace. The tension in the room was intense as we all waited for him to hang up the phone. When he finally did, he turned to us, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. They're outside the store," he stammered, struggling to find the words. A group of them, just standing there in the cold, not moving. Martha said they looked sick or something, like they were in some kind of trance, but she couldn't get a good look at them. Then the line dropped. My smile dropped from my face and my mind blurred for a minute as I processed the information. What could cause people to stand outside in the freezing cold like that? It wasn't like today was a Black Friday sale and everyone was lining up, especially not in nearly sub-zero temperatures. "What are we going to do?" I finally managed to ask. My voice was barely a whisper. Jack exchanged a serious look with Mr. Thompson and Mike, the weight of the situation evident on their faces. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, and his posture steadied. "I'm going to call the cops," he said firmly. "Maybe they can send someone to figure out what's going on at the supermarket, get them help if something's going on. Maybe she can't hear them and they're having an emergency." I nodded, grateful that at least someone was taking action. As Jack talked to the person on the other end, I thought about my little brother, probably still at school. Was he safe? I hoped that the school had taken precautions to keep the kids inside, away from whatever was happening out there. While Jack was on the phone, Mike spoke up. "I'm going to get my gun from upstairs. Left it here yesterday after we went hunting. Just in case." As Mike disappeared upstairs, Jack finished his quick call and turned to us. "I bribed one of my cop buddies with a promise of a few beers to come over and keep an eye on things. He said he'll head over as soon as he can. They're getting a lot of calls right now for whatever reason." Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes fixed on the window, as if expecting something to materialize out of the storm, before going down into his basement and getting a box of something I didn't recognize a few minutes later. There were these old-looking radio equipment. Most of them looked broken, or the metal was rusted on the system itself. Thompson threw the useless-looking ones out of the way and grabbed this old phone-looking device. "What's that?" I inquired as I stood next to the fireplace, trying to get myself as warm as possible in the cold air. "It's basically a shortwave radio system that people don't use much nowadays, thanks to their mobile phones. I've got one here and I gave another one to my friend who lives next to the supermarket a bit up the road." Thompson pushed the push-to-talk button and tried broadcasting over the interference the storm was causing. "Daily boy, you out there? Pick up. It's getting really bad out here." Nothing. No response for 30 seconds. "Dale, are you there? I told you multiple times that you should always..." A voice gruffed over at the receiver. It sounded pissed.
"I'm here. What is it, Thompson? I'm building something right now in my garage."
"Oh, thank God. Listen, Dale, the storm's getting really bad in our area. Can you check on Martha at the market? There's a bunch of people just hawking over her not going into the store. We need you and your trailer to get us that generator you were talking about a few days ago. Our power got knocked out," Thompson finished.
Yeah, I'll look outside and,
Static. Static was the only thing we could hear on the other end that came out in a howlful instant. "Dale, are you there? What's wrong?"
Sorry, I busted my damn radio after dropping it accidentally. But I can see the store from my house.
And?
Well, I can see the police are over there and, oh my God."
"What? What do you see?" Thompson demanded to know.
"They're shooting them. The police are shooting at the people outside the store."
Thompson looked at us with an angry expression on his face, thinking Dale was pulling a prank on us. "What do you mean the police are shooting at them?"
I mean, they're shooting at them, Robert. I can see them unloading on them right now and... Hold on, something's coming this way.
Dale, what is it? What do you mean, Dale? The line went dead for a final time. Jack's face had gone pale, and I noticed sweat beads forming on his forehead. His phone suddenly started ringing at the moment, the shrill sound slicing through the silent atmosphere. He pulled it out of his pocket and stared at the screen for a moment before answering, his hands visibly shaking. Hello? He put the call on speakerphone, and the voice of his cop friend he mentioned earlier crackled through the speaker.
Jack, I'm on my way. Should be there in about 10 minutes. Just hold tight, okay?
But before anyone could respond, a noise erupted from the other end of the line. It was a guttural, unnatural sound, like a distorted scream mixed with glass gently cracking.
Jack, I'm on my way. She'll be there in 10 minutes. Just hold tight, okay? Jack, hold tight. Jack, I'm on my way. Jack.
It kept repeating his name over and over again. It was like a creature that didn't understand human language, mimicking what it thinks humans should sound like. There was an icy flair to its voice, like it was creaking with every single motion it did over the phone. Mike grabbed the phone out of Jack's hand and hung up as Jack stood there frozen in place with a horrified expression on his face, with Mr. Thompson racing to his big gun safe in the corner to try and unlock it. There was another ring, yet nobody dared to pick it up, to even entertain the thought of interacting with whatever that thing is. You have 1 missed call from Lieutenant Bradley. You have 2 missed calls from Lieutenant Bradley. Mike turned off the phone himself, cutting off the calls from whatever that thing was. The room was heavy with tension, the unsettling silence broken only by the sound of our own breathing. Mr. Thompson's furrowed brow was evidence of his growing unease. Something's very wrong here, Thompson finally said, his voice low and intentionally quiet. We need to get upstairs. It might be safer and hotter than staying on the ground floor. Mike's face paled, his eyes darting towards the front door as if considering his options. I can't. I need to check on my boy back home, make sure he's okay. Mr. Thompson's expression hardened. Mike, it's not safe out there. His southern accent came through as he took a step towards him. You heard that broadcast. You heard that call. We need to stick together and stay put. Mike's hands clenched into fists, his desperation evident. I can't just abandon my son, Robert. I need to make sure he's all right. He's only 11 years old. Mike, we can't risk it. Mr. Thompson's voice was stern, his gaze unwavering as the two men were bickering heavily now, nearly yelling at each other. I ain't asking you to be the hero again or anything, Mike fired back, the tension in the room getting thicker. I just need to be sure my boy's safe. While those two kept on arguing, I looked at Jack as the tensions was flaring in the room. He caught my eye and motioned towards the stairs while the others were full-blown shouting at each other. Let's go upstairs, Sam, Jack said, his voice lower and more calming. They'll figure things out eventually. I nodded, glad for the chance to get away from all the yelling. We made our way upstairs, and Jack led me to a guest room at the end of the hallway. He closed the door behind us, like he was shutting out the craziness downstairs. Don't worry, he said, trying to sound calm, even as the sweat from his forehead was dripping down his brow. They're just having a heated moment like those two always do. It'll blow over soon, kiddo. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud crash, glass breaking, and panicked shouting followed by what sounded like Mr. Thompson screaming and a gun being fired again and again. What's happening down there? What's going on? I said to Jack as the noises were still violently going on downstairs, with the sounds of a struggle echoing throughout the house. Before Jack could even respond, there's this awful choking sound coming from downstairs, like someone struggling to breathe. I'm frozen in place, and we both turn towards the closed door as we hear more and more steps in the living room. Then a large, icy shattering could be heard. I don't know how to describe it. It was like if you smashed glass or ice with a hammer and the chunks exploded everywhere across concrete. Then nothing. Just shuffling noises were the only things we heard. There was at least 5 sets of footsteps walking around downstairs in a slow and methodical way, seemingly in random directions, like they were looking for something. "Sam," Jack turned to me and looked me right in my eyes as he spoke, gripping my shoulder so hard it still hurt. "I need you to listen carefully. Take this." He handed me his gun. It's a big pistol of some kind. I think it's a revolver. His fingers were lingering on mine for a moment as he stared into my eyes. "I'm going to go out there and see what's going on, but I need you to promise me something. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, do not open this door. Understand?" My heart was practically beating out of my chest at this point. I nodded as the saliva was filling in my mouth before I gulped, gripping the gun tightly in my hand. The entire house was quiet, apart from the sound of crinkling glass every few seconds and wind blowing in from downstairs. Jack slowly opened the bedroom door and stepped out, and I quickly locked it behind him. I heard him moving down the old stairwell. Each wooden step was creaking loudly as he headed down slowly. A voice soon came from downstairs. Jack's voice.
"My God, Bradley, is that you?"
I heard Jack say at the bottom of the staircase as I put my ear against the wooden door frame, straining to hear any more noises or voices. I could hear glass crinkling downstairs and slow shuffling straight towards the staircase.
"Bradley, what the fuck is wrong with you? What's that all over your face?"
I heard Jack scream loudly as there was more glass cracking downstairs and another crash. There were at least 6 more pairs of footsteps that were running up the stairs as I heard Jack yelling. He was pounding at the bedroom door, begging me to let him back in, as I heard the sickening, freezing noise coming from the door as his cries slowly died out. Then nothing. Nothing but the sound of the wind slowly coming from downstairs. The only sound I heard after 5 minutes was the noise of something hard and solid slamming against the door, and something slowly trying to open the door with the doorknob. It's been over an hour now, and I don't know what to do. I think the bedroom door can hold against whatever's trying to get in. I'm hoping. If anyone was in the area, please, help me. The police aren't picking up, and nobody's answering me when I call them. All the phones are down in the area. It's getting so cold now. I can hear the wind rushing into the house from the downstairs windows. The house is freezing. I hope it warms up soon. I was hunted by a cryptid in a snowstorm. By horror writer 1717. I never thought it would end like this. My truck's windows smashed, blood all over the interior, the frigid wind and snow blowing in on me as those 2 empty eyes stared in at me like a predator sizing up a helpless animal for the kill. It didn't start out like that, of course. When I started out for my morning run, it wasn't snowing. There was snow on the ground. There had been a quick storm with some squalls that left half a foot of the white stuff on the roads just a few days earlier. The state took care of it pretty quickly, and travel was barely interrupted. Everyone went about their merry way, even me. The fact that I hated winter even more than driving a truck never entered my mind. Okay, that was a lie. As I drove down the road, I found myself looking at the small piles of snow along the roadside and cursing them for not being big enough to cancel my run. I had to drive my truck through some pretty empty places, the kind that made you long for anything to break up the monotony of 2 lanes of asphalt surrounded by endless trees. I had to drive that route quite often, and it never got any easier to stay awake. I would even imagine seeing odd things looking out of the trees as I flew by. I knew it was my mind playing tricks on me, trying to scare me into staying alert and not crashing the truck. If it had been a deer or bear or something like that, I would have just laughed it off, but this thing looked like it was out of some nightmare. That's how I knew it wasn't real. There was no way it could exist, so I put it out of my mind and kept on driving. Fortunately, with it being a 2-day run, I was able to pick where I wanted to stay after I got my load. Hotels were nice, but if needed, I had the sleeper in my cab, which I called home away from home. It wasn't bad as cramped spaces go. There was lots of shelf space above the bunk. I had a TV mounted on the wall hooked up to a GameCube. There was a DVD player with an assortment of movies that I rotated out on a weekly basis. And there were some paperback books, Lord of the Rings, Frankenstein, This Present Darkness, along with all the indie author books I had on my phone. I didn't have to worry about being bored. There was always my laptop that held the novels I'd started writing and never finished. The only thing I really needed was food and sometimes a bathroom. I had snacks stashed around, sometimes in places even I didn't find for months, but it couldn't compare to a nice hot meal. I had my favourite stops on the road, and they all had two things in common: good food and a quiet place to park and sleep. I didn't like having my truck squashed up against other trucks, wondering if I'd be able to get my door open if they parked like an idiot. I liked parking near the outskirts of a parking lot. It was more private, and I didn't feel as hemmed in. Of course, there was a trade-off. More privacy meant walking further to get to the truck stop, sometimes a lot further. But I used that to my advantage. Nothing like a nice long walk to get the blood flowing to all those muscles I didn't use when driving. Unfortunately, the place was a local mom and pop operation, which meant they didn't have the money to stay open 24 hours a day. Usually, I would pull my truck into a spot in the evening, go get supper at the lunch counter, then grab supplies for the night. I'd always go inside one last time to use the restroom just before they closed at midnight. That evening, I followed the same pattern. Pulled in, walked into the store, got some supper, and went back in around 11:30 for restroom and supplies before going back to my truck and falling asleep. Normally, I try to keep a good watch on upcoming weather. For whatever reason, I hadn't that day. I woke up around 8 a.m. and looked out to a sea of white. It had snowed, and it had snowed hard. It looked like someone wanted to make up for the snow quota this winter and did it all in 8 hours. I dressed in my cold weather gear and went out to see how bad it was and if my truck would be going anywhere today. When I jumped out of the cab, my legs disappeared. There was at least 2 feet of snow on the ground, and it was still putting it down. I trudged around the truck to make sure everything was okay. Then I got back in the cab, brushing off as much snow as I could first. I climbed into the bunk and turned on the news to the announcement that a major blizzard had hit the area. Wow, I thought. That's some great investigating reporting right there. They were calling for another foot before the snow stopped. Great. Time to call the boss and get my ear chewed off.
Why can't you get here?
He growled. There's this stuff called snow, I said. It lands on the ground and piles up until it begins to impede travel.
Alright, smartass. When do you think you can be here?
Well, seeing that I haven't seen a snowplow go by and I'm sitting in a parking lot that probably won't get plowed out until much later than the highways, on top of the fact that my tyres are nearly bald even though I've been telling you for months they needed changed, I'll say I have no earthly clue when you'll see your precious cargo. He was silent for a long moment.
Do you like your job?
He said through barely restrained fury. Not particularly, I said, then added, when the weather's like this.
You might want to update your resume.
With that, the line went dead. Thank you for your support, I said to the dial tone. I settled back in, turned off the TV, and went back to sleep. When I first started out in trucking, a fellow driver gave me a tip that I'll never forget. Anytime you have the chance to get some rest, take it. That little tidbit helped me tremendously over the years. A little extra sleep means a lot less coffee. When I woke a few hours later and peeked outside, it was still snowing. I looked out my driver's side window and even my tracks were gone. I was feeling the call of nature and decided to brave the elements to take the trek to the truck stop for some relief. I felt a little silly for putting on all my cold weather gear, including gloves and goggles. That feeling didn't last long. It was snowing so hard I couldn't even see the truck stop. I drew an invisible line with the side of my truck, aimed in that direction, and started walking. I never read Call of the Wild. I never saw Alive. Maybe if I had, I wouldn't have been so eager to throw myself out into this blizzard just to go pee. Trudging through the snow and the driving wind was growing old quickly. I felt like I should have reached the truck stop by now. I paused and looked around. Two realizations hit me at the same time. First, I couldn't see the truck stop. Second, I could no longer see the truck. As a lovely addition, my tracks were also quickly disappearing. I tried to focus on my path towards the truck stop and began trudging again. 15 minutes later, I believe by sheer luck, I saw the store appear off to the right. My track hadn't been dead on, but I was close enough to find the place. My winter gear was starting to fail me, especially with the wind finding all the little places it could inject frigid air. As I approached, I breathed a sigh of relief at getting out of the cold, not to mention a massive cup of steaming hot coffee. I reached for the door, but it refused to open. Maybe it was frozen shut. I pulled harder, but nothing happened. I looked through the glass and saw no lights on. It struck me how the walkway wasn't shoveled either. Oh no, I thought. The storm has them stuck at home. My hopes for a nice warm toilet and a steaming hot cup of coffee plummeted. I took one last forlorn look at the dark store and turned back toward my truck. My disappointment grew as I realized my tracks were gone. I was now snowblind and navigating without a compass or any means of direction. I tried to draw an invisible line with the outer wall of the store and hoped it would lead me back to the truck. I felt my cold, wet feet protest as I headed back towards the warmth of my truck. I hugged my jacket, attempting to keep the wind out. The snow was up past my knees now and seemed like trudging through mud. In retrospect, it would have been better for me to wait in the truck until I saw a snowplow in the parking lot. I had plenty of empty tea bottles for bathroom emergencies. But there was no use chiding myself now. I had to get back to the truck to keep this mistake from becoming a fatal one. If I got lost and couldn't find the truck, no one would come looking for me. They might not find my frozen body until spring thaw. That was a cherry thought. As if my journey hadn't been hard enough, after a while, something caught my foot and sent me sprawling face first in the snow. I struggled to right myself and quickly wiped the snow from my face, silently thanking God that I had worn the goggles. I tried to get my bearings again, but curiosity nagged at me. What had I tripped on in the middle of a parking lot? I dug down and discovered the offending object. It was a parking space barrier. I chuckled for a moment until I realized to my horror that I should never have come near any of these in the middle of the lot. In fact, a straight trail from the store to the truck, the barrier I had tripped on would be a couple of dozen yards to the right. I scraped the rest of it off and saw it was running nearly parallel to my path. I had veered off course badly. The bright side was, I now had a point of reference and hopefully could correct my course. I looked around and found myself adrift in a sea of white. The store had disappeared and the truck was nowhere to be found. I took a deep breath and used the barrier to aim toward where the truck should be. I remembered one key fact in the process. These barriers lined the edge of the parking lot, and just past them was a drop-off. In retrospect, it was lucky I had tripped on it instead of stepping over it and rolling down a hill that I might never make it back up again. I turned to aim myself where I thought my truck was, when out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shadow of a figure walk by. I couldn't be sure because of the blowing snow made visibility nearly impossible more than a few yards away. It could have just been my imagination. I'd been out in the cold for much longer than I'd planned, and it was time to get back to the truck. I was suddenly reminded why I got out of the truck to begin with. I had to pee so badly. I did a quick look and saw nothing but snow, so I whipped it out and let it go. I think whipped it out was a bit of an oversimplification. I fought to unzip my frozen zipper as my bladder screamed a full red alert that it was about to release the floodgates, whether I was ready or not. I finally got it out and started the yellow stream when the wind shifted direction, sending it spraying all over my pants. I quickly turned so that the stream was downwind. When I finished, I looked down at the front of my now wet pants and swore internally. Yet another reason to find the truck quickly. Wet pants turned to frozen pants, and then turned to dangerous pants. I looked down at the barrier, now covered in flecks of yellow snow, and started on my new course. The snow had not let up one bit, and my energy started to wane, even though I had just been standing around for the last 10 minutes. Trudging through nearly waist-high snow was making me more tired than I had been in a long time. The wind rushing in my ears tore away my hearing. There wasn't anything out here to listen to, and yet I thought I heard something. I looked around but only saw white. Was this my mind starting to play tricks on me like it did when I was driving, and thought I saw the creature that doesn't exist peeking out at me from the trees? I turned back to my imagined destination, wondering if delusions were the first step in freezing to death. As if to answer, the wind hit me with a solid gust, knocking me down. If I didn't know better, I'd swear I felt a giant hand in the middle of my back before I fell. I looked up and saw nothing but snow, swirling around making mini tornadoes. I chuckled at the irony of them being called snow devils. I guess my own personal snow devil was pushing me around. I got up and started for the truck again. Every step felt like my feet were encased in concrete. I plodded on, trying to pull from whatever reserve energy I had to keep going. I couldn't die in the middle of a parking lot, just yards away from my nice, warm truck. That would be the ultimate irony. I walked on, barely conscious, wanting only my 18-wheeled safe harbour from this merciless storm. My head was down. I wasn't even looking anymore. It didn't make any difference. I knew I would never find it. I knew it was like looking for a needle in a field of haystacks. There's no way I would ever get back. I slammed into something and fell back. The snow was so deep I just lay there like a turtle, unable to get off my back. I looked up and saw the thing that had hit me was the back corner of the truck. 2 feet to the right and I would have missed it. I smiled, but it took a lot of energy. I focused everything I had into getting up. Adrenaline took care of the rest. I marched up to the driver's side door and reached into my pocket for the key to unlock it. I couldn't find the key. I ripped off my glove and searched again. Still no key. Despair smothered my mind. If I had dropped it in one of the times I fell in the snow, it was lost forever. And so was I. I leaned against the truck door, so close and yet so far. I could almost feel the heat through it. I smashed my fist into my leg in frustration, but felt more pain than I should have. I patted the other pocket and felt a lump. I tore off my other glove and reached into the pocket, pulling out the holiest of holies, the key. Tears streamed down my face and quickly froze as I stuck the key in the lock and opened the door. It took every ounce of energy I had left to climb up into the cab and collapse into the driver's seat. A wave of heat washed over me. For the longest time, I just sat there until I mustered the strength to start pulling off my cold weather gear. One piece at a time, I threw them into the passenger seat until I sat in my underwear only. I leaned my seat back and basked in the warmth that flowed over me like an ocean wave. I imagined sitting on a beach with the sun shining down on me and the water beckoning. I fell asleep like this. I woke to a sore back and stretched as best as I could in my seat, then looked out the windshield. The snow seemed to have let up a little bit and the wind wasn't nearly as fierce as before. There was still no sign of a plough, and there was no way I was getting anywhere without one. Off in the distance, I could almost see the outline of the store. I wasn't going there again until the parking lot was ploughed, but looking around I couldn't imagine how long that might be. There was at least 3 feet of snow already on the ground, and it was still putting some down. I crawled into the bunk and covered up for a serious nap. Hours later, I was starting to feel refreshed. I rolled over and turned on the TV, trying to see how bad things were. I couldn't even pick up the local TV station, so I stuck in a movie. After it was done, I decided I should probably take stock of my supplies, since I might be here a while. I had plenty of snacks, chips, pretzels, and jerky, among other things. As long as I didn't binge, I should be fine. I had drinks in the mini fridge too, but water wasn't a concern. All I had to do was bring some snow inside and melt it. I only needed to check one last thing to make sure I could outlast the storm. I looked at the fuel gauge. I rubbed my eyes and looked at the fuel gauge again. I only had a quarter tank left. That might last and it might not, depending on how long it took to get ploughed out. Obviously, once the plough freed me, I could drive 100 yards or so to a gas pump. As I was looking at the fuel gauge, my eyes drifted to the windshield and the field of white that stretched out in front of me. The snow had finally stopped. How long that would last, I had no idea. I could finally see the store clearly, but I could also see clearly that it remained closed. It was hard to believe anyone would be ploughing that amount of snow anywhere. I guess that's why they had the drop-off along the edges of the parking lot. As I softly chuckled at my realization, my eyes caught movement. There was some kind of animal walking around in the parking lot. At first, I thought it was a deer because of the wide horns on its head. But the longer I looked, the more I realized this creature was something else. It seemed bigger than any deer I'd ever seen. Its torso rode above the snow like it was a ship. Its face looked like it had wasted down to the bare skull, and it had massive teeth that went far beyond its jaw. It was rather haunting to look at. It was sniffing around in the snow. The more I thought about it, I began to realize that was probably the spot where I had taken a leak. I was mesmerized and horrified by this thing at the same time. I was nearly convinced my mind was playing a trick on me when it looked right at me and my blood turned to ice. Its look pierced my soul and made me wish I'd never come to this place. When it took its first step in my direction, I dove back into the sleeper and drew the curtain. I shook for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature, and I was breathing in panicked gasps. What was that thing? Did I really see what I thought I saw? How could a creature like that exist? I tried to settle down and get my breathing back to normal, but my mind refused to let go of the image of that thing. It's just my imagination, I told myself. It's just a deer roaming around out there. I told myself that same thing over and over until my mind finally believed it. However, I didn't look through the curtain to confirm it. I didn't call it denial. I called it not pushing my luck. I pulled out a pack of cheese crackers and turned on the first Die Hard movie to try to forget about the deer outside. I was 15 minutes into the movie when I felt the first nudge. I didn't know what else to call it. It felt like something had just nudged my truck. It was almost like when a strong wind gust pushed the cab, but I didn't hear any wind outside. The two sides of my mind engaged in a shouting match over whether I should check it out or ignore it. Fear threw its 2 cents in and ignore it won out. Until the second nudge. Actually, it was like the 5th or 6th nudge until curiosity took over and made me go and take a look. I peeked through the curtain and didn't see anything but snow through the windshield. I climbed out and looked through the passenger's window, but saw nothing. I chided myself for my skittishness when I looked through the driver's side window and saw a set of horns. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but they were gone. There were tracks in the snow that looked like deer tracks, only bigger, or was that my imagination carrying me away again? I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the creature poking at my tyres with its horns. I was fairly sure it couldn't puncture one with just horns, but didn't want to chance it. I reached down, grabbed my club, and opened the door to scare it away. But again, it was gone. I was beginning to question my sanity. Was this thing real? Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Or was it the creature toying with me, trying to draw me out of the truck? I closed the door and went back to my movie, but I couldn't get that creature out of my head. I was on pins and needles waiting, listening, anticipating the next nudge. Before the movie was over, I fell into a fitful sleep. I was in a tall building and there were bad guys everywhere. I had a machine gun, but had been better served hiding and picking them off one by one. I was sneaking up on one who was standing guard on an isolated floor when I turned the corner, and there stood the deer creature. It was massive, standing on its hind legs, and its horns scraped the ceiling. It looked at me with those empty eye sockets from its bare skull face, and made a sound that was half grunt, half growl, then started towards me. I backed away around the corner, trying to get back to my hiding space, but as I turned to run, suddenly the creature was in front of me. I pulled up my machine gun and started firing short bursts. I hit it in the chest, but it kept coming. As I backed away, I shot it several times in the head. I watched as chunks of bone flew, but it kept coming as if it didn't care. I shot at its legs, hoping to throw it off balance, but it had no effect. As if it had had enough, it charged, pinning me to the wall with its horns. I looked down as the blood began to seep from my belly around its horns. It pulled back and charged me again and again, sending shock waves of pain through my body and crushing my spine. It pulled back and allowed me to fall to the floor. Blood pooled around me as I tried to crawl away from the creature. I could only use my arms. I couldn't feel anything below my waist, which was a partial blessing because it cut my pain in half. After I had crawled a few feet, I suppose, it had enough of toying with me. It stomped its foot down on my neck so hard I heard a snap and my arms went dead. I could feel it tear into my back, ripping away pieces of meat. I could hear the sickening chewing and slurping as I was eaten alive. I woke with a start, sweat pouring from my forehead, and looked around the sleeper cab looking for the creature that was tearing me to pieces. After a few seconds, I came to the realization it had been a nightmare. I turned off my DVD player and stuck my head out through the curtain to check on my fuel situation. The needle was well below the quarter mark, almost down to an eighth. I looked out through the windshield and the snow had not magically melted. In fact, the wind had picked up and now it was starting to drift. Where there was once an even field of snow, now there were peaks and valleys forming, like dunes in the desert. The store was still dark and there was no traffic moving on the road. The sun was riding low in the sky, and I had yet to see another living soul. I wondered if my fuel would last until a plough could rescue me. Soon, I would have to give some serious thought to conserving it. It wasn't ideal. The thought of bundling up in blankets in the dark with no heater and no TV to watch wasn't exciting me, but it was better than waiting until my fuel ran out and I froze to death. As I killed the engine, I chided myself for not coming up with this plan sooner. I would have conserved fuel when the sun was out and the temperatures were higher. Now, I was going to pay for my lack of foresight. I dug out every blanket I had stored in my closet and laid them over the bed, then tucked in for a long nap. When I woke, I was drowned in utter darkness. I panicked for a moment before I remembered where I was. I looked at my watch and it was 4 a.m. I pulled the covers off me and was immediately assaulted by cold air. I grabbed a flashlight and found my way to the cab. I turned the key on and waited with bated breath that billowed out in clouds that filled the cab until the engine turned over. As it roared to life, I felt even colder. I looked to my left and froze. My driver's side window lay in pieces on the seat and floor. I slowly turned to look at the passenger side window when fear grabbed me. There was a face looking in at me, but it wasn't a human face. It was the ungodly face of the deer creature that had gored me to death in my dream. A river ran down my leg, forming a yellow puddle on the floor as I stared into the dark, hollow eyes of this thing sent straight from hell. It reared its head back and then smashed into my passenger's window, splintering it. It reared back again and this time shattered the window, reaching in for me with its fierce long teeth. I jumped back and landed in the driver's seat, full of glass. I knew I was dead. There was nothing I could do. I sat there as it entered the cab, coming for me. Its head was halfway inside when suddenly it stopped. It moved around a little bit, then roared in frustration. Its horns were too wide to fit in the window. It tried over and over to get them in, but there was no way it could fit with the horns. As suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. I looked around to see where it had gone, but the darkness of night covered it like a shroud. As I was looking, it silently reached in behind me and would have had me if it hadn't breathed out, warning me of its approach. I dove into the center console as its deadly jaw snapped shut right where my spine had been. It continued its assault on this window, gaining ferocity as it frustrated itself by not being able to get a hold of me. I stood in between the two windows, hoping I was safe from either direction. It was then I decided to go back into my bunk and close the curtain. I covered up and reached underneath the bunk to a secret compartment and pulled out my .40 caliber automatic handgun. I took the magazine out and made sure it was loaded with all 10 rounds, then put it back in, pulled back the slide and flicked on the safety. It made me feel a little better, but not much. I didn't know how true my dream was or if bullets would do anything to this monster. I no longer had any illusion that this was a deer. It was something much more dangerous and terrifying, and it was after me. I covered up with my blankets again, holding my gun close. The heater wasn't doing much good with 2 windows broken out. I would try to do something about them in the morning when it was light, but there was no way I was doing anything in the dark with that thing lurking out there. I lay there for an hour watching every second of the clock tick by, eyes wide open, ears listening for any sound, but there was none. Just the wind howling in between the 2 broken windows, making my curtains flutter. Eventually, I realized the futility of having a truck running and the warm air just escaping before it could even get to me. So I got out of my bunk, keeping my new best friend with me, and slowly made my way out to the cab, my head darting left and right to see if the creature was about to launch itself through either of the windows. I turned the key off, and before I could pull it out of the ignition, a set of horns smacked against the frame of the window, and the deadly teeth came in and snapped just inches short of my face. I whipped around and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. It snapped at me again, and I panicked until I realized the safety was still on. I flicked it off and aimed, but the monster was gone. I didn't dare make a move towards the window, for fear it would launch itself back in at me. I stood still as a statue and stared at the window it had come through, then slowly turned to the other side. I kept looking back and forth between the 2, trying to keep my peripheral vision on both at the same time. I was shaking, not only from the cold but also from the sheer terror of not knowing where or when this thing was going to show itself. I decided my cold weather gear would be my best option, so I climbed back into the bunk and put on as many layers of clothes as I could find. When I popped my head back out, I was met with the most terrifying sight imaginable. The monster had climbed onto the hood of my truck and was now bashing its head against the windshield, trying to make its way inside. I knew the windshield was wide enough that it would be able to get its antlers inside, and I would be done. I pulled the gun up, aimed at its head, and fired. The explosion was massive. I instantly lost my hearing except for the ringing in my ears. I staggered back, but the monster kept coming. Not only had my bullet done nothing to the monster, it weakened the windshield, making it easier for it to get inside. The monster shook its head in surprise when the bullet ricocheted off the bone, and then continued its assault on the windshield. It hammered on the glass until it shattered into a million pieces. I was already aiming at its face and fired 2 shots before the glass even hit the floor. They both ricocheted off its skull, causing it to rear up just enough for me to fire 2 shots into its chest. It didn't collapse screaming in agony like I wanted, but I could tell it didn't like it either. It jumped down off the hood and disappeared. I stared out into the inky blackness, trying in vain to pick up any glimpse of it. I whipped around from one side window to the other and back again, waiting for it to show its horrid face. After what seemed like forever, I saw horns rising through the passenger side window. I fired a shot into its face, and it disappeared. I threw myself back into the passenger seat when suddenly I saw its head rising in the driver's side window. I fired a shot, making it disappear again. I jumped up and threw myself to the other seat, knowing it would be on the passenger's side soon. Sure enough, 10 seconds later, it appeared and I fired another shot. It was toying with me. It disappeared and I threw myself over the passenger seat, waiting, aiming at the empty driver's window. But instead, I felt teeth clamp down on my neck. It had fooled me. I shoved my gun up under its skull and fired a shot. If I hadn't been deaf from the first shot, this one right next to my ear would have done it. And yet, somehow I heard it squeal in pain as it released me. I knew I had been inches from death. I reached up and touched the wound on my neck and came away with a handful of blood. I went back into my bunk, tore away a piece of sheet and pressed it to my wound. Then I tore some more of the sheet and tied it around my neck to hold the bandage in place. I went back out to the cab, only to see it crouching on the hood waiting for me. I never thought it would end like this. My truck's windows smashed, blood all over the interior, the frigid wind and snow blowing in on me as those 2 empty eyes stared in at me like a predator sizing up a helpless animal for the kill. It crawled through the remains of the windshield. I knew I was dead. In desperation, I shoved the gun into one of its eye holes and squeezed the trigger. The sound it made was something I'd never heard before and never wanted to hear again. The scream was both a low, guttural sound and a high-pitched shriek. It sounded like someone had unleashed a demon from the pits of hell. My mind screamed at me, "Get out of there!" I fumbled with the driver's door and ended up falling out when it opened. On a clear day, with no snow, I would have got a concussion or broken bones falling on the bare asphalt. With 3 feet of snow on the ground, I landed on a soft, cold pillow. It was the only time in the last 24 hours that the snow had helped me. I immediately jumped up and looked around for any place to hide, but there was nowhere. Everything was covered in snow. I glanced back at the trailer and realized the snow was so high that it reached the bottom of the trailer. I couldn't see underneath it at all. I quickly dove under it, then turned around and tried to pile the snow into the opening to hide where I had gone. I shone my light around at the beautiful sight of bare asphalt. I lay there on my belly, looking all around, trying to see in every direction at once to see where the monster would attack from. My breath blew out in billows of desperate smoke as I came up empty. There was nothing. The monster wasn't there. Yet. I didn't dare hope to imagine that my shot had killed it. If anything, it had made it even angrier. It was probably destroying the inside of my truck at that very moment. What I didn't trust was that the monster wouldn't find me underneath the trailer. I looked around for anywhere I could use as a better hiding place. My eyes fell on the wheels of the truck. It looked like there was just enough room to squeeze between the tires and the differential. That would be a tight squeeze, but it would be better than that thing finding me. I turned around and slid my feet in first. The further I slid, the tighter it got. Ironically, the grease and oil from the differential helped me slide through a little easier. When I almost had my shoulders through, it suddenly felt too tight. I was stuck. I couldn't move forward or backward. Panic flooded my mind, and I struggled frantically like I couldn't breathe. After the longest minute of my life, I finally managed to maneuver my shoulders through and into my hiding spot. The hood of my coat did double duty of keeping me warm and completing my hiding place.
I lowered it to the level of the asphalt and would raise it just an inch when I wanted to look out. The first half hour was the worst. The ringing in my ears had begun to subside, but I still didn't hear anything outside of my own breathing. The cold slowly leaked through my clothes. Still no sign of the monster. Another hour passed. My muscles started to cramp up. Still no sign of the monster. Another hour. I felt like my bladder would burst. Still no monster. During the long boredom in between, I pulled the magazine out of the gun and counted how many bullets I had left. No matter how many times I counted, it always came out to the same number. 1. I knew one bullet wouldn't save me from the monster. There was only one thing I could do with one bullet: end my suffering if it found me. I took it out of the magazine and stared at it. I used my coat to shine it up, then stared at my reflection in the gleaming metal. The edges of the snow around the trailer began to glow. I knew the sun was coming up. Darkness was no longer my friend. I was about to give up and crawl out of my hiding place when I heard it, a soft sniffing sound. I lifted my hood an inch, just enough to peek out, and there it was. Its head had broken through the wall of snow, close to where I dove under the trailer. There were a few drops of blood from my neck wounds, and it was sniffing them. Those drops would lead right to me. Sure enough, it took a turn towards the front of the trailer and looked in my direction. I lay there, still as stone, as it inched its way towards me. It was having trouble squeezing its massive body under the trailer, and I could hear it growling with frustration. It came closer, crawling right towards me. There was no doubt it knew I was there. I closed my eyes and stuck the barrel of the gun under my chin. I felt its hot breath and smelled the stench of death as I squeezed the trigger. Suddenly, it shrieked, and I could feel the truck buckling above me. I opened my eyes to the most amazing sight. Its horns had gotten caught in the chains dangling underneath the trailer, and it was tangled. It screamed and bucked and fought to be free from its metal captors. It yanked backwards so hard I felt the truck move sideways an inch. The differential was pressing on me now, and I had to shimmy over it to avoid being crushed. I watched as the chains broke away one by one, and then it was free. I took the opportunity to crawl out from under the truck. It was useless as a hiding place now. It had already tracked me here. I was almost out when I heard another sound, and I saw a shadow pass by the other side of the truck. It was coming back, but it was trying from the other side. I crawled as quickly as I could. This was my chance. If it searched from the other side, it might not know I had left. I had no idea where I would go, but it was better to be out of a useless hiding place. Besides, I desperately needed to stretch and pee. As soon as I stood next to the truck, I saw a large patch of red in the snow. I guess shooting it wasn't as useless as I thought. I took care of business first, peeing before I ruined another pair of pants. I finished and thought about where to hide. I looked up at the ruined cab of my truck when the nightmare crept around the corner. I stood there helpless. It had caught me flat-footed. I had nowhere to go. It stared at me as it limped around the corner. Its empty eyes seemed to exude rage. I pulled up the gun and aimed when it disappeared in a moving mountain of snow. The snowplow had finally arrived. I watched as the plow pushed its mound of snow past my truck and over the edge of the parking lot. The driver backed up and stopped beside me. "You been here all night?" the driver said. "Since before the storm." "What happened to your truck?" he said, looking up at my shattered windows. I followed his eyes and thought for a moment. "Someone tried to rob me," I lied, knowing the truth was unbelievable. "I see you took care of it," he said, looking at the gun in my hand. I looked down at the gun and stuck it in my waistband. "It's been a hell of a night," I said. "Well, don't worry. The roads are getting cleared and I'll get you ploughed out of here." "Thanks," I said. He nodded and backed up to continue ploughing. I looked at where he'd just ploughed beside my truck and saw a long smear of red. I followed it to the edge of the parking lot and looked over the side with my hand on my gun. The drop-off was a good 10 feet or more, and the snow had already started to pile up. I followed the path of red down the hill with my eyes and saw antlers poking out of the snow. I stared at them, looking for any movement. For 10 minutes I watched, and they didn't move. I was interrupted when the plough pushed another pile of snow over the side, covering the antlers. I watched for another 5 minutes just to be sure. The plough guy pulled up beside me. "You okay?" he said. I pulled my eyes up from the snow pile. "Yeah, I'm good." "You sure?" he said, pointing at my neck. "Yeah, I just got nicked by some glass," I said, remembering the teeth of the monster clamping down on my neck. "Well, I think someone just pulled into the store," he said. "Maybe you should get something for that." "I will. Thanks," I said, knowing I would do no such thing. I wanted to avoid as many questions as possible. I climbed into the cab, brushed the glass off my seat, and drove over to the fuel pumps. After filling up, I started the long trip home. I kept my cold weather gear and mask on, having no windows or windshield made for a frigid trip. The heater was on max and aimed at my feet, keeping the bottom half of me warm. I didn't call for a tow truck because I wanted to get away from there. I never went back to that truck stop again. I didn't want to take the chance of that thing being alive. I never told anyone else about the harrowing encounter. I wish I could erase it from my mind. As I drove towards my home terminal through the endless stretch of trees, I saw one of the creatures peeking out at me that I used to think was my imagination. Now I know better.
Something Came In from the Blizzard by Grace Omega. Last week, my town was hit by an unseasonable blizzard. I live in a country that doesn't normally get a lot of snow, and we were paralysed. Schools shut, employees told to stay home, and every shop in my town was closed, except for the one I work at. My manager decided that we'd corner the market by staying open, and I was chosen to man the till during a shift from 2 till 10 p.m. Of course, no one showed up all day. Why would they? The roads were impassable, and anyone who went outside got whipped by freezing, howling winds, as I discovered myself when I trudged through nearly knee-high snowdrifts to the store. The day passed slowly. I spent most of it staring at my phone, listening to the wind shriek outside and wondering vaguely if the roof was going to collapse. When news of the blizzard broke, people had stripped the shelves of essentials, so we only had junk food and some office supplies left, and I really don't think anyone could be that desperate to get their hands on either. At 9 o'clock, just as I was starting to wonder if I could get away with sneaking off an hour early, the phone rang. I picked it up, thinking it was my manager checking in on me. "Hello?" I said. Silence. The connection was poor, and there was a lot of hissing and crackling. After a few seconds, the call terminated. I hung up, assuming the phone lines were damaged, and wondered if the electricity was going to go next. I had barely finished this thought when the lights in the shop flickered. That was the last straw. I was leaving, and I didn't care if I got fired for it. But as I was getting up from my seat at the front till, I saw something unexpected. A customer had arrived. I hadn't heard her come in, which was strange, because anyone coming through the automatic front door would let in a blast of cold air and the howling wind. She was very thin and quite short, so much so that I couldn't guess her age. She stood, motionless in front of the doors, dripping water on the floor as the snow clinging to her clothes melted. "Hello?" I said. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I was beginning to wonder if she had hypothermia or something. Her jeans were soaked through, and she wasn't wearing gloves. Her jacket, one of those heavy-duty ones that zip up to cover most of your face, it was purple, and that will become relevant in a minute, was built for this sort of weather, but the rest of her clothes weren't. The customer jerked as though I had startled her, and then started to move with a strange, stiff-legged gait, quickly vanishing behind a shelving unit. Her appearance and the way she moved left me unnerved. I heard her wet shoes squeaking on the floor in time with her erratic, jerky movements, and had a prickle of unease run up my neck. I should have gone to help her. It's store policy when there's only one customer on the premises. It makes people feel appreciated. But I stayed where I was, waiting for her to come to me. Except she didn't. Her wet footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. I glanced around, leaning over the counter to get a better view, but there was no sign of her. Now I really started to worry. Had she collapsed? As I was getting up to go check, the phone rang again, nearly giving me a heart attack. This time, the call went through. It was my manager, and he was calling to tell me to keep an eye out for a teenage girl who had gone missing in the snowstorm, as the police thought she might seek refuge in the nearest available building. She had last been seen wearing jeans and a purple jacket. I freaked out. There was no sign of the girl in the store. She couldn't have left. I'd have heard the doors opening. As I was poking around the shelves, calling out in a softer voice than I intended. "Hello? Are you there? Are you all right?" The lights flickered again and went out. The night was bright with that odd blue haze that fills the air in a heavy snow, but I still had to take out my phone for light. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Wet rubber soles on the lino moving away from me. I stopped calling out. Something wasn't right. Lost, half-dead people didn't creep around like that. I got to the frozen food section, where there weren't as many tall shelves to block my view. Nothing moved in the darkness. Even the ever-present hum of the refrigerators was gone with the power out, leaving the store in total silence. "Hello," I said again. "Are you there?" Squeak, directly behind me. I didn't turn around. Of course I didn't. By this point, I was terrified. I just stood there, hoping like hell the noise had been my imagination. Something touched the back of my neck. Something as cold as ice. Now I turned around. In the pale light of my phone's torch, the girl's face was bone white. Blonde hair poked from under her hood, matted to her forehead and cheeks. But the worst was her eyes. The only part of her face clearly visible beneath the hood and the neck of her jacket. They were wide and bulging in terror, staring and unfocused. They were the eyes of a corpse. Somehow, I didn't scream. I was too scared even for that. I just gasped. Once, like someone plunging into cold water. I waited for her to rush at me, to tilt her head back and reveal a mouth of fangs, to leap onto me and sink her teeth into my face. She stepped closer to me and raised her arms. They moved stiffly. Her fingers were locked in a curled position, like a monkey's paw. I stood there, rooted to the ground in fear, waiting for the end to come. Her stiff arms wrapped around my shoulders. Her body was cold and heavy, like something carved out of stone. A low, moaning noise came from the girl's chest, a sound like the wind roaring outside. I flinched in fear. It took me a few seconds to recognize the hitching, muffled sounds coming from the frozen ruin of her throat. She was crying. I'm still not sure what made me do it. It didn't make any sense. I guess some human instincts are just too deeply ingrained to shut down, even in the middle of the worst terror. I put my arms around her. The girl vanished. There was no flash of light, no puff of smoke. One moment she was there,
and the next she was gone. It was like coming out of a fugue state. The terror of the last 15 minutes overcame me like a tide, and I ran from the store, straight into the storm, not caring that I wasn't wearing my coat or gloves. I ran all the way back to my parents' house, barely feeling the cold. The howling wind sounded like the frozen girls crying, and it followed me every step of the way. By the time I got inside, my nose and fingers were numb. I later learned that I had developed minor frostbite. When the storm ended and the snow thawed, someone found her body in a derelict field on the edge of town. She was 15 years old, and she had gone out into the blizzard unprepared for reasons no one understood to this day. The police speculate that she had gotten lost in the heavy snowfall and had blundered into the field. Maybe she mistook the shield of thin woodland surrounding it for the trees around her house and had stumbled through the howling dark, expecting at any moment to see the comforting lights of home. I'll never know why she came to my shop that night. Maybe she was afraid that no one would ever find her body. Maybe she didn't want her parents to suffer the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to her. Or maybe she just wanted to come in from the cold one more time.
I'm stuck on a mountain, sheltering inside the bus. Something is trying to get me. It was snowing heavily today. Everything outside was covered with snow. Only the inside of the bus was mostly snow-free. The bodies of the dead passengers were still unchanged because of the cold. As I was laying in my sleeping bag and looking at the body of a girl who was still holding a small teddy bear in her frozen hand, it reminded me how I got here. Dad and I were going on a holiday to go skiing in the local mountain. It was not a very popular destination because it was too far from the nearest town, and it was a pretty remote area except for one small village. The driver was visibly in a drunken state when we entered, but we didn't want to wait for another ride to the mountain because the rides to it were rare. We fell asleep during the ride, only to be awakened by the screaming of the passengers as the driver couldn't react in time and drove off the road. We went rolling down the mountain, and then everything went black. Looking back at it, Dad and I are lucky to have made it out alive and with minimal injuries. Can't say that the other passengers were so lucky. They were all dead after the wreck, including the driver. At first, we thought we would be rescued. We waited and attempted to endure as long as we could. We started a small fire using some wood we found in the forest and the clothing of some of the deceased passengers, since they won't be needing them anymore. We had some food with us, but it only lasted 3 days until we ran out. We melted the snow so we could have some water. At this point, we realized no one is coming for us. We packed some of our stuff and tried to get out of this valley, but a snowstorm made our efforts futile. We were forced to make this bus our shelter until we find some way of getting out of here. We tried calling for help using our cell phones, but there was no signal on this damn mountain. I sighed and got out of my sleeping bag as I saw that the fire was out. Dad was not on the bus. He must have gone to get some wood from the forest, I thought, as I shook the snow off myself. I looked outside once again while rubbing my hands together to get them warm. I hope that Dad comes soon. Being all alone with these bodies is getting me scared. I don't know why we kept them inside the bus and didn't just toss them outside. My thoughts were interrupted by the growling of my stomach, still needing something to eat. I started rummaging through the bags that were still on the bus. There was no food in the bags, only clothes and some health products. Defeated, I went to the driver's seat so I could see Dad when he comes back. On the seat, I found a handwritten note. I picked it up and it was from Dad. He said he was going on a hunt to get us some food and he thinks that he'll be back by the end of the day. I chose to just burn some of the clothing of the passengers to keep myself warm instead of going outside the bus because it was still heavily snowing. Hours passed and the night started to fall, but Dad had not returned yet. What if he had gotten lost and can't find his way back? Should I go out and try to find him? All of these thoughts were racing through my head, but I decided it was safest to stay inside the bus and wait. Days have passed since Dad left, and I can't hold out any longer without some food. I took my pocket knife and went outside to try and hunt something, or maybe find Dad, or his freezing corpse. I wandered aimlessly in the forest until I spotted a bunny who was standing next to a tree stump. The bunny's fur was so white that it resembled a ghost. The bunny was looking at me. Its eyes were wide open. Then it ran off. I tried chasing it, but it was too fast for me to catch. I looked at it as it ran into the distance. I returned to the bus and just looked at my knife before putting it back in my pocket. Before going back to sleep inside my sleeping bag, I threw all the bodies outside of the bus because they were all starting to creep me out. I had many nightmares in which the dead passengers came back to life and tried to eat me. And that night was no different. The nightmare always started the same. I would just sit in the bus by the fire, and the dead passengers would one by one come back to life and try to eat me. But this time, something was shaking the bus, and I heard my dad yell my name, which is when I woke up. I looked around the bus and outside of it, and thankfully, the bodies were still there. I went back to sleep while holding the knife in my hand. The following morning I went outside the bus to get some wood for the fire, which was getting difficult to find. Last time, I was only able to gather a couple of branches. A few meters from the bus, I found a pair of hoof prints. It was of a deer that had passed by last night. Too bad I didn't get to kill it. Would have been nice to eat some meat. As I was entering the forest, I got a strange feeling in my gut telling me I should return to the bus. I decided to ignore it and continued. The forest was strangely quiet, not even the birds were singing. While looking for wood in all of the snow, I saw something blue that caught my attention. I pulled it out, and it was my dad's jacket. But there was no sign of him. I searched and yelled his name, but there was no sign of him. It wasn't snowing last night, so if he was here, I would have found the footprints. Maybe some animal carried his jacket here? The jacket had a bizarre drawing on the back of it. It was some kind of animal. A deer, but it was standing on its hind legs. It was drawn in what looked like blood. Why would Dad draw this? I left the jacket where I found it and headed back to the bus disturbed. It was night and I was sitting by the fire trying to get myself warm when I heard it. It was a noise that I even today can't explain, but I will try my best. It was something like a human screaming, but more animal, if you can get what I'm trying to say. The first time the screaming lasted a couple of minutes. The second time, it seemed to get closer. In a panic, I put out the fire and hoped that it wouldn't find me. The screaming also lasted a couple of minutes, but it suddenly stopped. I did not move and just stood crouched down in fear. That's when I heard a knock on the side of the bus. I got the same feeling in my gut when I entered the forest. Then I heard my dad's voice.
"Honey, it's me, Dad. Are you okay?"
"Dad, where have you been all this time? I thought you were dead," I questioned, but he stayed silent.
"Like I said, I was looking for a safe way off this mountain, and I think I found it. Hurry up, we have to go now."
His voice seemed in a rush, and it changed a little bit. Hearing this, I took my backpack, and then I remembered the note. Something was not right. "Dad, didn't you go out to hunt for food for us, as you said in your note?" And then there was just silence. Then, something began to shake the whole bus. I was going to die if I stayed inside, so I pulled out my pocket knife and jumped out of a bus window. I fell in the snow and I ran. It was night, so I just ran forward. Not seeing anything in front of me, I heard the thing running after me. I don't know if it killed Dad or just used his voice, but it wanted to get me. I saw some lights in the distance. It was a cabin. I just hoped that the door was not locked. Luckily, the door wasn't locked, and I rushed inside, and quickly I moved the cabinet in front of the door. The thing that was chasing me didn't try to get inside. There was no sign of the owner. I don't know what to do. I'm so hungry. Part 2. A snowstorm had started outside, and I watched through the window looking for the monster. As long as the weather outside doesn't change for the better, I'm forced to stay inside this cabin. The fire was still burning inside the cabin, but the owner was nowhere in sight. I approached the fire so I could get myself warm. My hands were so frozen, I forgot I was still holding the knife in my hand. The knife Dad bought me for my birthday last year. I wish he was here with me now. I felt myself starting to cry, so I distracted myself by looking around the cabin. As I looked around the cabin, I noticed a map that was nailed to the wall. I approached the map to get a better look at it, and I saw that it was a map of the area. There was a village not far away from here. I don't know if there is anyone living in the village. Maybe it's abandoned. And with each passing day, the weather is getting harsher and harsher. But I will have to risk it and try to find help in the village. As soon as the weather outside calms down, I will go. My thoughts were disrupted by the growling of my stomach. I haven't eaten anything in days. I searched the cabin trying to find anything to eat. I managed to find some bread. I devoured it in seconds. I think that the owner of the cabin won't mind. With my stomach full, I looked at the barricaded front door. I hope that the cabinet I placed will manage to stop the thing from entering inside. Feeling tired, I fell asleep on the carpet in front of the fire, where it was nice and warm. The night was quiet, and I felt safe inside the cabin. I was woken up by a noise, but I thought it was just the wind that was raging outside. Just as I started to drift off to sleep, I heard it again, this time more clearly. It sounded like someone was trying to get inside. They were furiously pulling the doorknob to get inside. Then they began to hit the door with such force that the cabinet I placed in front of it started to slowly shift. Seeing this, I panicked. The monster was coming to get me. Fear took power over me. The only thing on my mind was that I needed to hide somewhere. I looked around and saw a closet and hurried to hide inside it. As I was hiding behind some old jackets, hoping it wouldn't find me, I remembered that I forgot my knife. The knife was on the carpet by the fire. I contemplated running out to get it, but it was too late. I heard the cabinet falling to the floor, and the door was opened. Cold air filled the cabin. It was so cold that I was shaking. I heard slowed footsteps pacing around the cabin from one room to another. I was relieved that it didn't check the closet. The footsteps seemed to have stopped. I couldn't hear them anymore. Maybe the monster gave up. I wanted to peek outside and check, but before I could even do that, the closet door was swung open and a hand grabbed me by my neck and dragged me outside. I was lifted into the air and pressed against the wall. I expected to see the monster that was hunting me, but instead, I saw a man. His brown eyes looked furiously at me. His black beard almost turned white from the snow on it. He had a gruesome scar going across his face. Some animal must have given it to him. He also reeked of cigarettes. "What are you doing inside my cabin and hiding in my closet, you little burglar?" he yelled, his grip tightening on my neck. "I was only seeking shelter from a snowstorm, sir," I said weakly, struggling to breathe. "How stupid do you think I am? You enter my cabin, eat my food, you barricade my door, and I find you hiding inside my closet," he shouted angrily. "But yeah, I forgot you were hiding inside my closet because of a snowstorm. He started laughing, loosening his grip on my neck. I was baffled about how this man can change emotions so quickly. One minute he was angry and about to strangle me, but now he's just laughing at my bad attempt to lie. The man continued to laugh for a little before getting his composure. Enough jokes. Tell me, what did you steal? Did you come in here thinking you'd find gold? Well, sorry to disappoint you, but that bread that you had eaten was probably the most valuable thing in this cabin. Then, without saying anything else, he put me on a chair and effortlessly tied me up with a rope. To say I was scared would be a lie. I was terrified of this man that might be a psychopath. After he tied me to the chair, he walked towards the fireplace and added wood to the already low flame. Then he turned around and spoke. And because of the weather outside, it's too dangerous to carry you to the police station myself. So, you'll be forced to stay here until then, he smirked. Now that we had some distance between us, I could see him more clearly. He was tall, had a muscular build, and was still smiling like a psycho. I tried to think how to get out of this situation. I could try to lie again, but since I failed the first time, I think there is no chance he would believe me. To try and run away is impossible because I'm tied to this chair. Do I just tell him about the bus wreck and how I got separated from my dad? I probably shouldn't tell him about that thing that chased me here and how it used Dad's voice. He already thinks I'm a burglar. I don't want him to think that I'm insane. But then again, he looks to be crazy himself already, so this could work. Listen, I was in a serious wreck. The bus I was on went off the road. All the passengers died, except my dad and me. Dad and I tried to survive and wait for help to arrive, but days passed and we ran out of food, so Dad went hunting. I waited for him on the bus, but he never came back. The man seemed intrigued, so he pulled out a chair and sat across from me. His face was now serious again. I continued to speak. But one night I heard someone knocking at the side of the bus, and I heard Dad's voice, but there was just something off about the way he spoke. I realized that it wasn't Dad, but something else, and I had to escape. It chased me to this cabin, so that's why I'm here. The man just sat there in his chair and looked at me. I know it sounds made up, but you have to believe me, I begged the man. The man didn't react to my begging. He was deep in thought. He must think I'm insane and is too shocked to react. Did you speak to it? The man finally spoke, catching me off guard. I thought for a moment and remembered I did speak to it. Yes, I did speak to it, but only briefly. The man stood up from his chair. Then you are in danger. It will stalk you until it can finally kill you and devour your flesh. But why would it want to kill me? What is this creature? I questioned the man. It's a dark and evil creature. Some call it a demon, an evil spirit. But the most popular one is the Wendigo, the man said as he untied me. I'm heading to a nearby village, and it will be safer for you to come with me. There we can contact the police and inform them about the bus wreck. Alright, I'll go, but what about my dad? He is still somewhere in the forest. He is in danger. We have to find him. If he was gone for so long, he might already be dead, because the Wendigo was using his voice. When I heard this, I couldn't stop myself from crying. I knew that the possibility of him being still alive was small, but somewhere deep inside of me, I hoped that he was still alive. The man seemed to regret his poor choice of words. He put his hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry for upsetting you. That's not my intention. There is still a chance that your dad could be alive, but it's slim. Listen, let's go to the village. We can get help there and organize a search party to find your dad. Then we should hurry to the village, I said as I wiped the tears off my face. The man nodded his head. Give me a minute to pack a few things, the man said as he went into a room. I still don't trust this guy, but with the Wendigo still out there somewhere, it's safer to go with him. I looked out the window and saw that the snowstorm had ended. This is good, I thought. It will make our travel to the village easier. As I turned around, I bumped into the man and fell onto the ground. "Are you ready to go?" the man asked, giving me his hand to get up. "I am," I said as I took his hand and got up. "Are you sure? You seem to have forgotten something," the man said as he gave me my knife back. "Thank you for giving my knife back." I took the knife and put it in my pocket. We went outside the cabin. It was daytime, so I could see the surrounding area that was outside of the cabin. The cabin was on top of a small hill and it was surrounded by trees. Everything was covered with snow. It was like a place from a fairy tale. "Do we need the map?" I asked the man. "Don't worry, I know the way to the village, just follow me," the man said, not turning around. I followed him to the back of the cabin and there was a sled covered with snow. The man whistled and 4 dogs jumped out of the snow. They were huskies. "Don't worry, they don't bite," the man said. We got on the sled and we were on our way. It was pretty exciting to ride a sled being pulled by dogs. The ride was silent. The man would only speak when he was giving commands to his dogs. We were going down a small path in the woods. Then all of a sudden, a tree fell on the path. It almost hit us. We had to stop because the tree was blocking the way. I wanted to ask the man if we could still get to the village, but I noticed that he was looking in just one direction. I looked in the same direction, and that's when I saw it. It was tall, standing at about 12 feet. Its head had animal-like ears with antlers. Its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones, with its bones pushing out against its skin. Its complexion the ash grey of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets and glowing like hot coals. It looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody. Its body was unclean and suffering from suppurations of the flesh, giving off a strange and eerie odour of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. It had long limbs, its fingers gnawed off to expose the bones-like claws, and sharp, pointy teeth. I was about to scream in fear, but the man put his arm over my mouth and stopped me. He then whispered into my ear, "We have to leave the sled here. Just follow me, but don't run. You must walk. And whatever you do, don't look behind you." I just nodded my head in agreement, and we started to slowly walk away from the sled and off the small path. The dog started to whine as we moved away more. The man was calm and not as terrified as me, like if seeing this terrifying thing was nothing new to him. The Wendigo wasn't chasing us for some reason. How did he know that it won't attack us if we just walk away? I thought about what would have happened if I went alone to the village, but then I heard someone. "Honey, where are you going with that man?" "Dad?" I turned around hoping to see Dad, but instead I saw a shape running towards me. It was the Wendigo, and it was moving supernaturally fast. What transpired next was in like some kind of movie. The Wendigo pounced at me. The man tried to move me out of the way, but the Wendigo was too fast. The Wendigo managed to hit me, and the hit sent me into the air. I heard the man scream in pain, and as I fell onto the ground, I heard a loud bang noise and that weird animal-like scream. I lay on the ground, my back throbbing in pain. The man picked me up and yelled, "We have to run." Even though I was in pain, I mustered the strength to run. I looked back for the last time and saw that the Wendigo was crouched down. It looked like it was hurt. It was being attacked by the dogs. One had even managed to jump on its back and was biting him ferociously. I ran in the woods for what seemed like an eternity. When I noticed the man wasn't running next to me, I turned around and saw that he'd fell to the ground. I ran to him, and I could see that he was bleeding. His blood was all over the ground, giving the snow around him a red colour. I managed to get him up on his knees. He had a huge gash on his right arm, going all the length from shoulder to elbow. He was barely conscious. "You're hurt. I have to stitch your wound or you will bleed out. We won't be able to make it to the village in time," I said, panicked. "There is a place," the man whispered weakly. "The old hunter's cabin, just past that creek over there." I dragged the man past the creek and through some bushes, and we made it to the old hunter's cabin. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. Damn it. I have to find a way inside. There was a chair next to the door, so I sat the man on it while I was looking for a way inside. I tried to open a few windows, but had no luck. Defeated, I returned to the front door. There was a doormat in front of the door. It was old and worn out. I pulled the doormat off the ground, and under it, I found a single key. It had to be the key to the door. I used the key and unlocked the door. I dragged the man inside and locked the door after me. I laid the man on a bed. He wasn't conscious anymore. I had to act quickly. I took his jacket and shirt off. I looked at the gash on his arm. I had to stitch it up. I looked for a needle and thread inside the cabin, and I found them inside one cabinet. With a shaking hand, I held the needle and looked at it. I hated needles. I would always cry when I had to get a shot in the hospital as a kid. But Dad would always tell me to be brave, and that would calm me down. "You have to be brave," I said to calm myself down. It was my first time stitching someone up, but I managed to stop the bleeding. The man was now stable. He was sleeping, so I let him rest. The cabin was cold, but there was some wood in a crate next to a stove, so I started a fire. I don't know if the Wendigo will find us again. I hope to not have to encounter it again. When I dragged the man, he left a trail of blood behind us, but a snowstorm has started outside, so I hope that it will cover the blood trail. Part 3. The relentless snowstorm showed no signs of abating, leaving the cabin's windows ensnared in a thick frost, obscuring any view of the outside world. My forays outside were reserved solely for collecting snow to melt into water, a vital lifeline in this desolate landscape. Amidst the harsh winter, our most pressing concern was the scarcity of food. The Wendigo, a fearsome and malevolent presence, made venturing out for hunting an unthinkable risk, shrouding us in a palpable sense of vulnerability. Moreover, the waning supply of firewood added to our burden, reminding us that time was rapidly slipping away, demanding decisive action. However, there was a glimmer of hope as the man had recovered from his injury, albeit carrying a permanent scar as a reminder of the harrowing ordeal. Seated at the table, surrounded by a haze of smoke from his cigars, the man's stern tone resonated with wisdom as he lamented my imprudent actions. Grateful for our survival amidst the brutal attack, he emphasized the gravity of the situation, highlighting the significance of the journey ahead. His determination to press forward was evident as he readied a formidable sawed-off shotgun, explaining its limited capability against the Wendigo, which would only weaken the malevolent creature, not vanquish it. The true way to defeat the creature, he revealed, was to burn its frozen heart, a perilous task that loomed ahead. In unison, we decided to set forth towards the nearby village, our only hope for sustenance and survival. However, the unforgiving cold and the deep snow made every step a grueling struggle. As the chill seeped into my bones and the biting wind lashed against my face, I found myself lagging behind, unable to keep pace with the resolute man. Though I urged us to turn back, my pleas fell on deaf ears, and we continued onward. Despite my struggle to keep up, I eventually caught up to the man, only for him to halt abruptly, leaving me bewildered and anxious about what he had seen. As I approached, I discovered a grisly scene concealed beneath a blanket of snow. A human corpse marred by vicious bite marks, with its organs savagely torn away. The sight was a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in this desolate land. The man's cold and uncaring gaze conveyed a haunting detachment from the horror before us. Overwhelmed and nauseated, I had to step away, grappling with the stark realities of our predicament and the gruesome world we found ourselves in. We continued to the village, our hearts heavy with dread, fearing what awaited us there. As we entered the village, an eerie silence engulfed the air, broken only by the howling wind. The houses stood empty, doors ajar, and the snow-covered streets were devoid of life. With every step, we encountered more corpses, frozen in grotesque postures, their lifeless eyes staring into oblivion. The village had become a graveyard, a testament to a calamity that had befallen its inhabitants. Among the dead, we found signs of struggle, claw marks on the buildings, and blood-stained snow. It was evident that a fierce battle had taken place, but it seemed that the villagers had been overwhelmed by the malevolent force they faced. The man's stoic expression wavered, his eyes betrayed a sense of sorrow and guilt. He had hoped to find aid and supplies here, but instead we discovered a tragedy of immense proportions. Amid the despair, we noticed a faint, flickering light coming from the village's chapel. Cautiously, we approached, and as we entered, we were met with a sight that sent shivers down our spines. In the centre of the chapel, surrounded by candles, we found a grim scene of devastation. The lifeless bodies of the villagers were laid out, each with signs of a fierce struggle. The chapel had become a makeshift morgue, a haunting reminder of the malevolent force that had ravaged the once thriving community. The man and I stood in solemn silence, paying our respects to the fallen villagers. We knew that they had fought valiantly against the Wendigo, but its power had proven too great to overcome. Realizing the enormity of the challenge ahead, we understood that the Wendigo was more powerful and cunning than we had ever imagined. The man's determination hardened, and he knew that our only hope lay in confronting the creature directly, even if it meant facing almost certain death. As the storm raged on outside, we huddled together in the chapel, preparing ourselves for the inevitable showdown with the Wendigo. We knew that the next encounter would be our last chance to put an end to the horror that had consumed the village and threatened our very existence. With heavy hearts and unwavering resolve, we readied ourselves for the ultimate battle that would determine the fate of not only ourselves, but also the souls of the villagers who had fallen victim to the Wendigo's malevolence. In the dim light of the chapel, we began our preparations for the imminent confrontation with the Wendigo. The man meticulously crafted traps and weapons using whatever materials we could find. He taught me the best way to use the shotgun against the creature, emphasizing the importance of precision and timing. As the hours passed, the man's stern expression softened occasionally, revealing glimpses of the camaraderie we had developed over the course of our harrowing journey. He shared stories of his past, of battles he had fought and lost, and of the people he had loved and lost. It became evident that he saw me as a surrogate family, someone he had taken under his wing in this bleak and desolate world. As we approached the fateful moment, our hearts pounded in unison with the storm raging outside. The man urged me to stay hidden during the initial confrontation, knowing that the Wendigo's focus would be on him. He had seen its power firsthand and knew the chances of survival were slim. I protested, not willing to let him face the creature alone, but he insisted, emphasizing the importance of my role in delivering the finishing blow when the time was right. We left the sanctuary of the chapel, venturing into the biting cold where the Wendigo lurked. The snow whipped around us, adding an eerie backdrop to the impending clash between humanity and malevolence. The man lured the creature into a trap, expertly using himself as bait. As the Wendigo charged at him with terrifying speed and ferocity, the man unleashed a barrage of shots from the shotgun, each one hitting its mark. But the Wendigo was relentless, and even with its heart weakened, it showed no signs of backing down. In the midst of the chaos, I found an opportunity to land a crucial blow. With trembling hands, I aimed the shotgun, my heart pounding in my throat. But just as I was about to pull the trigger, the Wendigo veered towards me, its clawed hands reaching for my throat. I stumbled backwards, fear gripping every fibre of my being. The man, without a moment's hesitation, threw himself in front of me, taking the full force of the Wendigo's attack. I watched in horror as he was thrown aside like a rag doll, his body limp and motionless. Rage and grief surged through me, fueling a newfound strength and determination. Gathering every ounce of courage, I steadied myself, focusing on the Wendigo, my hands no longer trembling. As the creature turned its attention back to me, I remembered the lessons the man had taught me and fired the shotgun with precision, hitting the weakened heart of the beast. The Wendigo let out a spine-chilling howl, its frozen heart shattered, and it fell to the ground, writhing in agony. This was my chance to deliver the finishing blow. Summoning all my strength, I grabbed a makeshift spear nearby and thrust it into the creature's heart, ending its malevolent existence once and for all. As the storm subsided, the silence that enveloped the village was deafening. The man, lying still on the snow-covered ground, had sacrificed himself so that I could have the chance to vanquish the Wendigo. Tears streamed down my face as I realized the cost of our victory. With a heavy heart, I whispered my gratitude to the man for all he had done, promising to honor his memory and the memory of the villagers who had fallen. I knew that the journey ahead would be lonely without him, but I also knew that his sacrifice had given me a chance to survive and carry on the legacy of hope and bravery in the face of darkness.